You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is October 13th, 2020, and today we're going to be talking with Steve Stockton. Steve Stockton has written many books. He's a great storyteller, including My Strange World. He co-authored We Are All Children in the Wilderness of the Afterlife, a guided tour through a haunted life. He co-authored that with Sysco Murdoch. And he also wrote Strange Things in the Woods, a collection of terrifying tales. Now, the new version of that we're going to talk to him about is a collection of basically both books combined into one. And we're just going to get right to it. We'll be right back on Conflict Radio with Steve Stockton right after this. Well, welcome back to Conflict Radio. We've got Steve Stockton on the phone. He's the author of Strange Things in the Woods, a collection of terrifying tales. He has also co-authored We Are the Children in the Wilderness of the Afterlife, a guided tour through a haunted life with Sysco Murdoch. Steve, how are you doing today? You there?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Man, it certainly is an honor that, you were able to take the time to join our show today. You want to tell us about, I guess, your most recent book?
Well, the most recent one would probably be My Strange World, which that's a book of my own encounters. And the way that came about, my first book, Strange Things in the Woods, that was stories that I'd collected basically all my life from family and friends of family and things like that. And I put all those together. And then after that came out, I would go on shows like yours. And invariably, either the host or if it was a call-in show, the callers would say, well, these are other people's stories. What about you? Have you ever had any experiences? And I've had a lifetime of strange things happen to me. So I would pull out one or the other and tell that. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, well, there's probably enough here for a book. And there was actually probably enough for another one if I ever get around to writing it. But that's how My Strange World came about. And that's the most recent one, unless you count the one I did with Sysco. We did that after, but that's really her book.
So what are some of the experiences that you've had? Could you tell us some?
Well, I saw my first full-body apparition when I was 6 years old. I saw what looked like a toddler it's a long story, but looked like a toddler that ran across the street at an angle down into our yard. And if you've ever noticed kids when they just barely mastered walking, sometimes they'll start running and then don't really know how to stop, and they just crash and burn and fall down. Well, this kid runs across the road into our yard, gets about 15 feet or so into the yard, falls down, and he was gone. I didn't take my eyes off the spot. I was probably not more than 100 feet away from it and walked straight to it, and nothing there. No kid, nothing I could have mistaken for a kid, no hole that a kid could have fallen into or anything like that. To this day, I have no idea what that was all about. I did some research on the road there. Never been any kid hit by a car or anything that I could find. And a lot of the people that lived on, it was a inverted T intersection, and the main road that came down, that was where my grandparents' dairy farm was and had been there for decades. So they knew everything and everybody. And my grandmother on that side, she was a self-proclaimed gypsy witch. And she told fortunes. She liked to read tea leaves and coffee grounds, animal entrails. That was how she predicted how their crops were going to be and things next year. In addition to the dairy farm, they had vegetable farming too. But she was well-versed in all things supernatural and paranormal. They came out of the spiritualism movement around the turn of the last century. And another thing, just being from the part of Appalachia, this was in West Knoxville, but she was from Cades Cove in that area of the Smokies, and just superstition runs rife up there. She knew how to interpret the signs, as they say, but usually everything was a bad omen, some sort of portent or a warning. But I asked her about that, and she just said, well, sometimes you'll see things that nobody else sees, or you'll see things that's actually meant for somebody else and you just happen to see it. But it basically, the supernatural's way of letting you know that, you're different and that you do see things and experience things. And that's, I think I was around 13 when she told me that, and I just accepted that. Like, okay. But that's just one. That was the first real incident, that kind of, and it didn't scare me at all.
Mm-hmm.
It made me curious, like, what was that? I knew kids didn't run across the road and fall down and disappear. And it just that was the impetus. That was what started me in a lifelong journey into the paranormal and the supernatural. Not long after, back then about the only real TV show you had was Leonard Nimoy In Search Of, and that played on the public broadcast affiliate there in East Tennessee. So that really turned me on. And then I found books by Frank Edwards, Hans Holzer, people like that at the library. And, that just, there you go. Once it gets its tentacles into yours or its talons, I think it just, it gets a grip on you. And the thing about it, just despite all the years that I've been into all this, I have more questions than answers. But that's part of the fun. I mean, there's some things I wouldn't want the answer. That would take a lot of fun out of it. The thrills in the chase, I guess.
So, do you think that our reality is the reality that is, or we're just kind of we're the out of place beings? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's so many different schools of thought on that when you get into quantum physics and portals and black holes and that time, some people say time isn't linear, or that it is, but there's several different time streams, and that would explain the Mandela effect and things like that. It's fascinating to think about, and my answer is I don't really know, but it's fun to think about. I think there is a lot more out there than what we see in our physical world, and the physical laws and things that we have, that it doesn't necessarily apply to the other worlds that we live in concert with, that are unseen perhaps for the most part.
Yeah, yeah. It definitely is interesting to think about. All of the different realities and perception of dimensions and things that. I mean, we really don't have any idea what any of this is.
Right. I mean, even things like time and space, the way we measure that is by ways that we've come up with. So, that's just our version of it. Who knows how things really work, especially when you consider that something like space is infinite, that there is no end to it. And, it boggles the mind. That's one of those things. I'm an insomniac. I rarely sleep more than 2 or 3 hours a night. But if I do lay down and I'm awake at night, that's the kind of things that roll around in my head. It's just pondering the universe and our place in it.
So, what would you say your scariest experience would be?
Well, there's three that kind of tie for first. Well, one more so than others. The absolute most frightened I've ever been. I had a black-eyed kids encounter back in the '90s, and it was just such an irrational fear. And I think that was the thing that was the most scary about it. Is two little girls, but with black eyes. But I'd never felt such a fear. And I've had things chase me in the woods. Those are the other two in the top three there. But something about those black-eyed kids, there was just such a prevalence, such a sense of evil, such a feeling, an aura of evil, if you will, that came off of them. And I'm still today, I'm at a loss to explain it. When I recount that story, and it's another lengthy one, but I relive that. There's almost a trauma, sort of a post-traumatic component of that.
Did
And
they get you while you were in your car, or did they knock
yeah,
on
I
your
was I
door?
was trying to get into my car. I'll tell a shortened version of it here. I was working doing network administration for a medical company in West Knoxville, and I was moonlighting doing the same thing for other firms. And I had a comprehensive breast center that was redoing their network, and this was early mid '90s. They were just coming off the dumb terminals to where they were going to have computers at every station, actual computer. So I was in there wiring their network, and I'd go in after hours. I'd start around 6 or 7 in the evening after I'd finished my day-to-day job and work till midnight or after. And this time I was getting close to finishing. It'd been about an 8-week contract, I think. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I came out, locked the door and everything behind me. I was the only one there, had access codes and keys to the building. And I come out to a deserted parking lot, except for my car. And I notice over on the far edge of the parking lot, there's two people, two children, sitting on the curb. And I thought, well, that's weird because number one, it was in more of an industrial business type area. There were other doctors' offices and some industrial stuff, warehouses and things like that in this particular area. No homes or anything around. And I thought, that's strange for these kids to be out here 2 o'clock in the morning where there's no houses or apartment complexes or anything nearby. And at the time, I was driving a little Mazda Miata, and I was trying to get all my networking tools and cable and everything in the back of it. And Miata, the trunk on them's not much bigger than the glove box on some cars, so it was like playing Tetris, trying to get everything in there. And I look up, and they've stood up, and they've started walking. And they get a little closer and a little closer. And I never actually saw them walk. Excuse me. What had happened, I think, was whenever I'd look away from them, that was when they walked. But every time I looked up, they were standing closer, just standing. And finally, they got up under the street light that was there in the parking lot. And that was about half the length of the parking lot, maybe 15 yards away from me at this point. And I noticed that, they don't look right. And I could see once they got under the light there that they had literally no eyes or eyes that were blacker than black. And there was a taller one and a shorter one. I'd say the taller one was probably maybe 12 or 13-ish. The other one, I would say 10. They both appeared to be female. And by the time they got to where I could see them, the taller one began speaking, not to me, but about me to the shorter one. The shorter one never spoke, but the taller one launched into this almost like a litany. It was, he'll have to let us in the car. He'll give us a ride. He won't leave us out here. It's cold. It's dark. We're all alone, but just over and over and over nonstop. And I thought, okay, this is getting really weird. So I'm trying to get everything in my car and get out of there. And by the time I finally fumbled around and got everything in the car, fumbled with the door handle. It had a billet-style handle on it, and I couldn't get in. I'd left the top down. So I jumped over the door, get into the car, had trouble starting the car, of course. And by this point, they're right up to the car, within distance of touching it if they wanted to. And the taller one is still, he'll give us a ride. He won't leave us here. He'll let us in his car. He has to. And finally, the engine roars to life, and I took off, and I actually drove down through the lawn of the place rather than backing out and going out the way I should have. Went through the grass, jumped the curb, hit the road, and just as soon as I left, I had this eerie feeling. And first of all, the fear that I felt coming off this, it was incredible. The only fear I could liken it to was the times that I have been chased by something in the woods, but on an even greater scale than that. It was a feral, not even a fight or flight type thing. It was just flight. There was absolutely no fight to it. But the whole way, I kept looking like over my shoulder and in the rearview mirrors of the car, even glancing over at the seat like I expected them just to show up in the car or be running along beside it or right behind it in the mirror, which, that's just so irrational. And I'm usually a pretty rational, analytic person. And at the time, the girl I was dating only lived a couple miles away, and I'd planned to go and spend the night there so I could get as much sleep as I could and then get to my regular gig in the morning. But when I left, I went the other direction, went to my parents' house, which was in Oak Ridge, about 20, 25 minutes away. And going down, there's a connector there, a highway, Pillsippi Parkway. It runs between the airport, the interstate, and then into Oak Ridge. And driving down Pillsippi Parkway, of course, it's a big 4-lane with turnouts, but I was doing like 90 and 100 miles an hour just because I wanted to put as much distance as I could between myself and these little girls. Same thing, kept looking back, looking behind me, looking in the mirror. And not for the police. I wasn't worried about the police. The police would have been welcome at that point. Get to my parents' house. I pull in the driveway and go all the way around behind the house and park, which I'd never done before, parked in the grass, and then spent the rest of the night peeking out the windows and making sure everything was locked up until daylight. And then I called into my regular gig and said, I won't be in today, and went to sleep. Again, I have no explanation. That was my only encounter, but it was just that fear. And like I said, I'm usually pretty fearless. There's only two other times in my life that I've genuinely been scared by something like that. And that one's, I'd say it's the top. There's kind of a trifecta there. There's the other two were things that got after me in the woods, but those are other stories. But yeah, the black-eyed kids, and I was real, as much as I talk about the paranormal and have written about it and stuff, I've never written that one down. And I was reticent to tell it for a long, long time. And the reason being, I'm part Cherokee, and the elders, excuse me, the elders will tell you that there's certain things you don't talk about just because it feeds off that energy of fear, or just even thinking about it or discussing it can give it power over you. And for a long time, I didn't want to talk about it because I essentially relive it. You can probably hear it in my voice now. I get kind of nervous. My palms sweat when I talk about that encounter.
We had a guest on. I actually got an email from a listener who sent me a story of a black-eyed kids, and I actually reached out to him and got him on the show, and you should listen to it. And then I had an expert join us as well, and it was a three-way conversation with the three of us, and it was an interesting tale. Now, what happened was he also, I guess that's what the black-eyed kids do. They try to get a ride somewhere when you're getting into your car. And what happened with this guy was about 20 years later, the same kids knocked on his door. So if I were you, I'd be very careful about who you're opening up your door for.
Absolutely.
Don't just open up your door. Make sure you look out the window and make sure it's not those black-eyed kids if you get a knock on your door, because they're still out there and they're going to find you.
Oh, yeah, the first time I ever told it was on the old Art Bell show, one of his later incarnations. Mm-hmm. And Art was sick that night. Heather Wade, his producer, was manning the microphone. And she and I are friends apart from all this, and she knew about the story, and she kind of goaded me into telling it live on the air, which I did. And then later that night, this was probably more like 4 or 5 in the morning, there was a real loud knock at the door. And I have motion detectors, I have security cameras, perimeter alarm. I know before anybody gets anywhere near my door. Nothing showed up on any of that. Not only was there a knock, but it was followed by a high-pitched scream that sounded like it started on the porch, came through the house, and went out the back of the house. And no idea what that was. My adult daughter was living with me at the time. I ran to her room and flung the door open. I'm like, "Are you okay?" And she's like, she was sound asleep. And I kind of explained what had happened, and she said, "I told you not to talk about those damn black-eyed kids." So it's one of those things, and a lot of times when I tell it like this, I'll have something weird happen. So we'll see if anything happens this time. But I hadn't heard of them coming back like that, and the fact that they were still kids, because that was one of the things I've wondered. I've noticed here lately, I've seen some reports of black-eyed adults showing up. And if you think about that, some of these reports, some of the earlier ones, first ones, were in the 90s. If you think about that, if they were kids then, if they age like we do, they're adults now. So is that where the black-eyed men and women that are showing up now, are they kids, black-eyed kids from the past? Or this one that you were talking about there, it looked like they remained the same, that they hadn't aged. So that throws a whole new twist into the story.
Yeah, I just my natural sense and curiosity, and I hear that when you hear about them and you talk about them, like we are now, that your chances of seeing them improve. So who knows? Maybe I'll see them now too. That we've talked about them and brought them up. So
well, whatever you do, don't let them in. I've only heard one story of somebody that let them in, and supposedly right after just all these tragedies befell her husband, I think, died, and then she came down with some strange form of cancer, and just basically, I can't remember the lady's name, but I've heard her give her story, and basically just turned her life into a living hell after she let them in. And I think once they were in, then they just disappeared or they left or something.
Do you
Strange, but
do you
yeah,
think it's possible that they're ghosts?
I think it's something other than ghosts. I think it's some sort of entity for sure, but I don't know what their purpose is, what they're up to. But you think about that. There's always, in the modern era anyway, there's always some kind of sightings of things that are almost normal, but not quite. Like during the 40s and 50s when you had that UFO flap, you had the Men in Black, which, they drove nice new cars, they wore nice new suits, but there was something off about them. They spoke with an accent, or their skin didn't look right, or they seemed robotic. Well, then later on, you have things like, say, the Phantom Clowns. Again, oh, it's clowns. Everybody loves clowns, but these are weird, creepy clowns that come out of the woods and chase people. And then you have, like the Black-Eyed Kids. Oh, kids. Everybody likes kids. Who would not let a kid in? But then it's creepy kids with black eyes and strange clothing. So it's like there's something out there that maybe keeps trying to send something to infiltrate or talk to us or intimidate us or whatever, but they just can't quite get it right. But I was on Where'd the Road Go with Soraya Askath one night, and we were talking about that. And I said, maybe there's something that is more successful and that we haven't heard about it because people did let it in, and that's why you never heard what happened. And I said, if I ever go missing, it's probably because there was black-eyed bikini models with pizza and heavy metal records that showed up at my door. So there are certain people that you would let in, and just, of course, a kid, to this day, I mean, I probably wouldn't have let a kid back in back then, but I certainly wouldn't now. I would offer to call somebody for them or but I'm not going to take them anywhere. I'm not letting them in. I'm not coming out where they are. I'll talk to you through the screen door, and you're lucky if I do that.
Yeah. So let's move on to We Are All Children in the Wilderness of the Afterlife. Now, this is an interesting book, isn't it, the way it's been written?
Oh, absolutely. And Soraya is also involved with that one. The way that started, I'd been on Soraya's show a couple of times, and he messaged me one day, and he's like, I've got somebody that I think you'd like to meet, that you would enjoy talking to. And it was Sysco Murdoch. And I don't know if she had been on his show or if she had just been corresponding with him, but she's got just a wealth of information and encounters and things that she's had. So he put us together, and some of our experiences were similar, and our childhoods were similar in a way. She's from New Jersey by way of Alabama and spent time in both states. I may have that turned around, but anyway, I'd grown up in East Tennessee. She grew up in northern Alabama to some degree, so we had that in common. And I remember it was on a Sunday, and I went and sat out on the back porch to take the call, and it was full daylight probably. It was in the afternoon, early afternoon, I think. And by the time we finished, it was full dark. And we had talked for, if I recall, and she can probably tell you for sure, it was around 6 hours, maybe 7 hours that we had talked just pretty much nonstop. And just, she had all these stories and encounters. And I kept after her, like, Sysco, you need to write this down. You need to write these stories. And I explained how my book originally came about. As the real epiphany was my grandmother's funeral when I was 13, and I was looking at her in the coffin there, and I thought, all those stories, all those tales, all those superstitions, everything she ever taught me or told me or scared me. I was scared of her when I was little. She looked like a witch, and I thought it's all right there with her, and it gets buried with her unless I take that mantle to retell these stories, to remember these stories. And that was when I decided to first start committing things to print, even just writing it out for myself as a way of remembrance of all these stories, because she had 10 kids, my mother, and 9 boys. So talk about a rough upbringing. You couldn't get anything past my mother. With 9 boys in the family, and she
Yeah.
the only girl, she knew all the tricks. I couldn't get away with anything. But my other cousins didn't have any interest in stuff like I did. I was my grandma's favorite when it came to that because of the paranormal aspect. And according to her, I was born with a caul over my face. That's a big thing in the South. And all it is, it's the afterbirth is still over the face of the baby, and they remove it. But in the Appalachians, that's a sign that a child has second sight or is blessed or is fortunate or whatever. And she took that to heart and ran with it. So I instantly became her favorite. But anyway, yeah, and that's how I got started. And I told Sysco that story, and it really impressed her, I think. And she's like, I'm going to do it. And then finally she agreed. It was much later on, several months after that, I think. She said, okay, I'm going to do it, but you're coming with me. And I'm like, wait, what? And she said, what I want to do, I want to tell a story, and then I want you to come along behind it and comment, tell an anecdotal story, something similar, like almost like a color commentary in sports, and I agreed to do that because I wanted her to get the book out there, and we ended up that way. And when she was writing it, excuse me, she would send me a chapter, I'd read it, and then write my thoughts and things. And I kept waiting until everything was finished before I sent her my parts. And I ended up, she loved it. I didn't have to change a thing. And a lot of them, I really had to rein myself in because I didn't want to overshadow and take away from such a wonderful story that she had told.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us one of the stories in the book that you thought was the most interesting?
In Sysco's book, definitely, well, there's so many. It's almost like picking a favorite child. Um, I will say the chapter on Gettysburg that alone is worth the price of the book. She's had some really amazing ghostly adventures in Gettysburg. That one is among my favorites. Another one in there talks about something odd that her mom ran over with the car once when they were little, that when she was little, anyway, that she couldn't figure out what was. And oddly enough, I had a very similar story in my book that happened to one of my uncles and some cousins, and probably in about the same area. They lived in Scottsboro, Alabama, and they were driving up to East Tennessee to visit my grandmother. They were in 2 cars, one behind the other, and they were going through a swampy area, old 2-lane highway, and something was crawling across the road. Um, my uncle, who was driving the lead car, the one that actually hit it, he thought it looked like a big cat. Like they have sightings of those in Appalachia, even though they tell you they don't exist. Black panthers or painter cats, they call them down there. Well, whatever it was black. It was in the road, and he hit it. And my cousin, who was driving the car behind, said it looked like a guy in a wetsuit crawling across the road. So they get farther on up the road. They didn't stop or slow down at that point. But when they get to my grandmother's, which was probably another hour away at that point, there was blood all over the front of the car and down the sides, and they decided to go back. My uncle was like, to his son, like, we probably better go back and look. We may have killed somebody. So they drive back. They find the place. There's nobody, no carcass, nothing there. There is some blood on the pavement and on the car. And they said they watched the news and the papers and things for weeks. Was there a missing scuba diver or any report of somebody finding a body, either of a human or of a large animal? Nothing. So again, no idea what that was. Well, Sysco had a very similar story, and probably around the same area where her and her mom, and I won't tell too many of her stories here, she'll skim me alive, but her and her mom were driving and hit something with the car. It was something black. It was in the road, felt the car go over it, and they were afraid to get out of the car. They thought it was under the car. But again, kind of the same thing. There was nothing there, no evidence of anything having been there other than the impact with the car and the car bumping up and down. No explanation. Apparently there's a swampy area in northern Alabama where there's stuff that likes to crawl out of the swamp and get hit with cars.
Huh. Oh, that's interesting. You know, the weirdest thing, I also live in Alabama. I'm in the Rocket City. And the weirdest thing that happened to me down here, I was with a bunch of friends. I guess I was about 18 or 19 years old. And we were driving through the country. We were going to start a fire, like a little campfire out in the middle of the, nowhere. And we were driving along the road just looking for trash or kindling or something to help get the fire going because it was a little wet. And we come across a cardboard box that was on the side of the road, and we thought, wow, that'd be perfect, to help get the fire going. And we hopped out of the car and went to grab the box, and inside was a cow's head,
Oh, wow.
just a cow's head. It was completely severed, like in a straight line, and just a cow's head in a cardboard box on the side of the road. It was, we didn't take it. We didn't take the box. we
Uh,
just we just
Things
got
like
out of
that
there.
make you wonder what's going on, you know?
Yeah, it's just a cow's head in a cardboard box on the side of the road. It was the weirdest
I've
thing,
heard
man.
other stories. To my uncle and his family lived in Scottsboro, but my cousin married a guy and they lived out in Skyline. Now, I don't remember where that is in relation to Scottsboro, if it's north, south, east, or west, but I know it's nearby, but it's kind of a remote area. And there were stories out there where they lived of a lot of cult like activity out in the woods. They'd see fires and hear people chanting and then see evidence of animal sacrifice and things like that. I don't know what that was all about, and that was years ago. I heard those stories back in the 80s.
Yeah, there's
So,
definitely some weird stuff that goes on in the country of Alabama. That's for sure.
yeah.
Now, you said you were Cherokee, right? Well,
hmm
you were raised in eastern Tennessee. Now, have you heard about the Cherokee Little People?
Oh, yeah. I've got a video on, I have a YouTube channel called 13 Past Midnight. I've got a video on there called Little People the Smokies. That's a very prevalent story, especially among the Cherokee. Now, I'm only an eighth Cherokee. It's on my dad's side,
Uh huh.
but I heard a lot of the stories and things, and yeah, it's a legend there, and
Wasn't it
a
like
lot
in
of
the 1820s they found like 100,000 graves of these little people in eastern Tennessee? Have you heard about that?
I've heard about that. I have no verification of it or anything, but I've heard that, and I've heard that there were skeletons and things found too. So
Yeah, I guess they call them the moon-eyed people.
yeah, and the Cherokee, they respected them, but they didn't have a lot to do with them, and considered them dangerous and responsible for all kinds of things,
Yeah,
stealing babies and
something to do with a giant snake as well.
yeah, there's the Cherokee were just such storytellers. They've got a legend for everything you can think of. Every bug, every flower, every tree, every lake up there's got some kind of legend attached to it. There's a lake there in the Smokies that supposedly devours animals. There's a Cherokee legend of a deer wading out into a lake, and suddenly it's surrounded by a whirlpool. Deer goes out of sight, and then just the fur and the bones remained floated to the surface.
Wow, that's
So, and then you've got stories like Spearfinger, which was a shapeshifter or a skinwalker, if you will, that could take on any form, but she usually appeared as an old, kindly old grandmotherly type that was lost in the woods and needed your help getting home. But Spearfinger, the name comes from one of her fingers was replaced with a long piece of black obsidian that was sharpened to a point, and she liked to steal people's livers and eat them, particularly children. Now, some of this you wonder if it wasn't just cautionary tales to keep their kids out of the woods at night, but there is something in those woods and in the Smokies in particular. I mean, you have a lot of missing person cases there where no trace of them's ever found, like the Dennis Martin case from 69, Trini Gibson from, I think she disappeared in 77, 78, 79, somewhere around in there, Thelma Pauline Melton in the 80s, on up to, there's been disappearances there in recent times. And if you follow David Paulides and his missing 411 stuff, he covers those cases and talks about them a lot. There's something there, and it's not just in the Smokies. I think it's everywhere in the woods and mountains. And even out here on the West Coast, you have Mount Shasta down in California, just below the Oregon border, and it's had all kinds of legends. There's robots, there's races of people that live underground, there's UFOs, there's according to the Native American tribes in that area, there are rocks that will open up and swallow people and then close back. So
Well,
maybe there's your explanation for the disappearances.
Yeah, that's another thing. I guess there's a lot of Indian lore about the reptilians and a big war that happened out around Utah where the reptilians were pushed underground.
Hmm. And I think that's where a lot of your legends, especially in the Uinta Basin there in Utah, where the Skinwalker Ranch is. And that's supposedly all that happens on that ranch because it's under a curse by, I think it was a Navajo medicine man. I think you have the Navajo and the Ute out there, if I'm correct. And there was a war between them, and then supposedly they banded together and fought these reptile people that came from the stars, that came from the sky in their legends. So yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff out there too. It's everywhere. If once you start looking into this and delving into it, you find all these legends and all these things that have happened in different places. And a lot of times you'll hear similar stories. I don't know if that's just an urban legend thing or what, but like the Crybaby Bridge, you have those everywhere. And I mean, there's famous ones in Texas and New Jersey and places like that. But I found like getting out into little small communities in Tennessee and Kentucky, that if you talk to either the oldest people you can find or the teenagers, they always know the best local legends or stuff that has gone on there. And that Crybaby Bridge is everywhere. And, is it one of those things? I mean, has there really been that many women that went crazy and flung their babies off bridges? Or was it just told in a way that it passed from person to person, from community to region, and so on? But I've heard some of the same tales from some of the same eras in regions that were quite a distance apart. Like my dad grew up in Middle Tennessee on the Cumberland Plateau in Fentress County. My mom grew up in the Cades Cove area, and right on the border there with North Carolina in the Smokies. But when they compared stories, they realized that they had heard some of the same exact stories growing up, but with just a different location. The versions my dad had heard were local to his area, and my mom had heard stuff local to the Smokies, but it was the same story. So I wonder if it was just, at a time when oral communication was how most news was spread. There's a lot of those people didn't have radios or anything like that. So maybe and the South has a great oral tradition anyway. That's what I blame for me talking so much like I'm doing now. Love to talk, and it's in our nature to tell stories and recount things that have happened. And that was a winter pastime when you couldn't farm or hunt or fish. You gathered around the wood stove, and if you didn't have a radio, you told stories.
So, Strange Things in the Woods. You've redone that book and re-released it, correct?
Yeah, with a traditional publisher, and they redid it. Actually, when I first published it, it was in 2 volumes, Strange Things in the Woods and More Strange Things in the Woods. So I found out I had enough tales to at least fill one more book and probably a couple more besides. And when I went with the new publisher, they decided to combine those 2 books into one. And there's some extra stuff in there too. New cover, re-released it. They brought it out in paperback and in an audiobook version too. So really excited about that. It's doing great. And I've been on a lot of amazing shows talking about it, because with that publishing machine came a publicist and things like that, that really opened a lot of doors for me. I've been on Coast to Coast and, stuff like that. Just, it's a dream come true. If there's anything I enjoy almost as much, if not more, than writing, it's coming on shows like yours and talking about it. I love to interact with people.
Yeah, and just so all the listeners know, I'm looking at the book right now on Amazon, and it says audio or Audible audiobook is $0.00 free with Audible trial.
Yeah, if you sign up for Audible subscription, you get so many credits you can use for free. You can get my book there. And I think I even have a link there. I think it's audible.com/Steve Stockton. I'll find out for sure. You can put in the show notes if you want. But you can get some extras and stuff that way if you use my link to sign up. Now, I have gotten a little bit of feedback off that. There's a lot of people, because I do narration and stuff. I have my YouTube channel, 13 Past Midnight, and I also narrate for Missing Persons and Mysteries channel. A lot of people tell me they like to listen to my voice. It's very relaxing, etc. I don't hear it. I've never liked the way I sound. I've come to grips with it, but I always thought I sounded like an educated hillbilly, which basically what I am, so I guess I should claim it. But when the publisher decided to bring it in an audiobook format, they hired a professional narrator to do it. And, I didn't have any say in it, and that was fine with me anyway. But I've gotten some backlash off that. People say, well, Steve, why didn't you narrate it? I mean, they didn't ask. So I will say, though, that on my channel, 13 Past Midnight, I have done my narration of a lot of those stories that are in the book.
Awesome. So people can go to the YouTube channel and listen to some of the stories in the book there.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. So could you tell us some of the stories that are in the book? Could you tell us a story today?
Oh, sure. Pick one of my favorites. Oh, one, it happened to some cousins of mine. This was in Fentress County back in probably the late 20s, early 30s. Two sisters had gone out to pick berries. And now then we know, especially through David Paulides' work, that a lot of times berry fields and people out picking berries are the people that things happen to. But back then, and when I wrote this story, I didn't know that connection. But they'd gone out to pick berries and were out in the woods, and they were near an old railroad track that was, at that point, had gone out of use. And I think the rails had been ripped up, but it was just still the rail bed and the cross ties there. And so they're on this hill overlooking the railroad track, their old railroad bed. They're picking berries, had old lard buckets and little tin lard pails that were used for everything in the South. Kids carried their lunches to school. Coal miners carried their lunches to work in it. It was just one of those things. When the lard was gone, you had a million uses for a tin bucket. Well, they're trying to fill their buckets up here and get back home. And the younger girl looks up at her older sister. She had said something to her and didn't get a response. She looks up at her sister, and her sister's just standing there staring off. And she calls her name. No response. Well, she looks down to where her sister's looking, and there on the old railroad bed is an old wooden coffin of the pine box variety floating along the railroad track. I said there was nothing under it, nothing over it, nothing, there to account for such a sighting. Excuse me, I've got seasonal allergies and have to clear my throat every little bit, but it scared them, for sure. I mean, if you're a kid and you see a floating coffin, and they knew what it was, they dropped their berry pails. That was it for the berry picking, ran back to the house. And again, like I talked about, people in the South being very superstitious, their mother told them that it was some sort of a warning, that it was that most likely somebody was going to die. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, within, I think it was a week or two, there was a lady that lived in the direction where the track was and where the direction the coffin was headed to, that passed away unexpectedly. That was always their reasoning behind it, that it foretold the death of the neighbor lady. But to me, that's just frightening, just see a coffin in the woods would be scary enough, but to see one that's floating with no visible means of support, and why along an old railroad track? I mean, of course, that's path of least resistance. If you had to go pilot a coffin through the woods, that would be the way to take it. It's along an old railroad bed, because there's nothing growing up there. You'd have a path. Beats me, man. I don't know. Yeah, but that was the story as it was told to me. Fascinating stuff.
So what do you think's going on in the woods? Do you think, I mean, obviously we've heard stories of Bigfoot, and David Paulides always talks about, the missing kids and missing people in the woods. What do you think's going on in there?
Oh, wow. I think it kind of overlaps, because you have so many things there. You have the missing people, you have Bigfoot, you have Dogman encounters. Now I don't know if that's just being reported more is why it's at the fore, or if there's more of a prevalence of those sightings.
So what is a Dogman exactly?
Hell,
Like you're talking about werewolf?
yeah, it's basically a werewolf, but it's more canine than lupine, is the way I've heard it explained. That it's more like a dog than a wolf, but it kind of exhibits the same behaviors, and I don't think it's quite like the werewolf legends that all those came from Europe, Eastern Europe, where it's somebody that's cursed and the full moon turns them into a werewolf. Dogman seems to be its own creature, that it's not a person that transforms, it just is. I've heard stories of, there was one guy in this might have been at Skinwalker Ranch, I don't remember, but a guy witnessed what appeared to be a portal, that it was just like a shimmering light, and it opened up, and then a dogman on two legs, no less, just kind of strolls out and walks off into the woods. So, what on earth was that? So that makes me think they're visitors from another dimension.
Well, did it walk out on like 2 feet or 4 feet?
No, it walked out on two legs. It was on 2 feet. Now, I've never had that kind of visual encounter, but in a way I'd love to, and in a way I don't really want to. It's one of those things. You don't really know how you would react, but I think I'd like to see it as long as it didn't see me. So that was the thing. This this encounter, it didn't seem to notice the person watching it. So I don't know. I've never seen a Bigfoot. I've seen tracks. Now, I currently live out in the Pacific Northwest. I'm in Oregon, just outside of Portland, and I've gone over into Washington State, which is just across the river, and there's a lot of areas over there that have been active historically and are still active. Mount St. Helens is one. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest is right there in the shadow of Mount St. Helens. A lot of Bigfoot sightings there. If you've ever heard the Ape Canyon legend, where the miners back in the 20s were attacked.
I haven't actually. Could you tell us that story?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there was some miners that were out there in, I think it was in the mid, maybe the late 20s. I'd have to look it up. But they encountered a tribe of Bigfoot. At the time, they just called them hairy men. They're in their vernacular, whatever, there wasn't any Sasquatch or Yeti or anything that they were aware of, but what they were describing is a Bigfoot or Sasquatch-like creature, tall men that were covered in hair. That's a Bigfoot. But this was a group of them, and they had somehow angered these beasts, and
they could have been Italians.
What's that?
They could have been Italians.
There you go. But the miners had holed up in this cabin because they were scared to death of these things, and they were under siege for, I think it was at least a day, maybe two. The things would pound on the cabin and try to get in. At one point, they described a fur or hair-covered arm reaching through a hole in the wall and trying to grab an axe. Finally, there was one of the miners that went outside and he shot one that was up on a bluff where the cabin was below, and he shot the thing and it fell off the bluff. He said a good 200 or 300 feet and fell down into the canyon they were in there. And the next day they were able to get out of there. And that guy went on to write a book. It was, I want to say, I battled 8 men on Mount St. Helens or something like that. And if you look up Ape Canyon attacks, it's documented that way. But there's a group recently, I believe they're from California, paranormal group, that have been going up onto Mount St. Helens trying to locate this area where the cabin was. And last I heard, they think they found it. They thought what they believed to be the main beam for the roof of the cabin and some handmade nails and things, because the original cabin burned, it was in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And, excuse me. And if they've located the area where the cabin was, which they're pretty sure of, this area it's too rough for logging or anything like that. So, and there's no homes or anything up there, so there wouldn't have been that many mine cabins around. If they have located the cabin, then they think that somewhere near that canyon, or near that cabin in the canyon there may be a skeleton from the one he claimed that he killed, that he shot and killed. So who knows? If they have the right address, maybe there's some Bigfoot evidence there that nobody's ever seen the likes of yet.
Yeah, you got to hope the Smithsonian didn't beat them out there, or they'll hide it in their little.
Yeah, from what I understand, it's very remote, and they're being very, very secretive with like the coordinates and things like that. They won't even say a lot about it, much less give out that kind of information. So, and I can understand that. Who wouldn't want to be the first one to discover a skeleton? But if they do find Bigfoot, I hope it's one like that that's already deceased. I hope that it's not one that they kill or that they take alive. Well, that'd be the most horrible thing because they're going to poke and prod it and draw blood and examine it, and that would just be a terrible life if it is a sentient being like we led to believe in most cases.
Do you think they're interdimensional, or do you think that they're hiding in tunnels underground?
I think it's a little of both. I think that they have some sort of habitat out there. There's stories of them living in caves and being underground, but I don't know. Again, it's one of those things that I can see both sides of the argument for the interdimensional being and just some species that we're not familiar with that's really good at camouflage and staying hid. But I like to think maybe it's both, and maybe it is some sort of being or species that exists with us that we're not familiar with, but it also has some sort of ability to travel in a different way through space and time than we do. And we talked about that, how space and time are measured are ways that we've come up with that may not necessarily actually to apply the way things are that we don't know about. When quantum physics and things like that, they've only recently proven or disproven things that have been theories for decades, in regards to that. So I think there's a lot of things where we still have a lot to learn scientifically.
Now, let me ask you a question. If you were hiking out in the woods, you said you were right there in Oregon, and Oregon itself, you don't even have to go to Washington, has tons of woods and things. So
Oh yeah.
if you were out, say, near your house, and you were walking through your woods, you're just going for a day hike or whatever, and you stumbled upon a portal or somebody coming out of a portal, and were like, "Hey, why don't you come with us? Back through the portal here. We can't guarantee you'll ever come back here, but come on with us, and we'll check out all that's over here." Would you go?
Oh, I'd be tempted, especially after the year that we've had this year, all things considered. But it would be interesting. I mean, I would miss my family and things, but wow, talk about an adventure and chance of a lifetime. Uh, I honestly, I hope I'm never in that position because I can't honestly say that I wouldn't go through it just to see what's on the other side.
Yeah, and
Um,
then what would happen? You would be a missing person in the woods.
that's kind of what I thought, that maybe these people that go missing, and especially the cases where there's absolutely no trace. And I've heard people say, "Oh, well, there's predators out there, or they went out in the woods and took their own life." If you can find out a way to do that and not leave any evidence, I mean, even a predator, there'll be clothing, there'll be blood, there'll be possibly screams, following an animal attack. There's been people that have disappeared just almost within sight of other people, where they go around the corner and then they're never seen again. There's some supernatural element there or something that we don't understand that's beyond our comprehension.
Yeah, it definitely makes you curious as to what's really going on. Now, how many people a year go missing just out
It's
in the woods? I don't mean missing, in general. I'm just talking about people like that go out for walks in the woods, or that just totally disappear. I mean, are there any stats on that?
I've seen some, and I can't recall the hard numbers off the top of my head, but it is astounding how many there are that go missing. And again, that's the stuff like David Paulides looks into, where they rule out accidental deaths and drownings and things like that. These are people that just vanish, and
Yeah, and their cars are found at trailheads and things,
cars
right?
are found. Sometimes they'll find their campsite, or they'll find some things that are left behind. It's common for them to find clothing and shoes. Now, if you're lost in the woods, I don't think you're going to strip off or take your boots off. That, especially the boots. I can understand hypothermia. you're freezing to death, but you feel overheated. I can understand stripping some clothing off, but I've heard, weird stuff about where they find people's boots up in a tree or something like that. That makes me sound like you went up instead of wherever. So I don't really know. And then, there's other things. There's people that claim, well, there's serial killers that operate on the Appalachian Trail. Well, if they are, they're the most successful serial killer that's ever been, because how many victims have they claimed with no evidence, and then nobody's ever seen them, heard them, I don't think you could have 100% accuracy in any type of crime like that. Now, it may be a mixture of things. It could be human predators, animal predators, what some of the other theories about what goes on out there, that people that do take their own lives. But again, that's the thing. If you can figure out a way to do that and not leave any shred of evidence behind, then I don't think that's possible. There's going to be a body. There's going to be something left behind, even with animal predation.
So the stories about Bigfoot, I'm just curious, are they, you hear about Bigfoot in Oregon, you hear about Bigfoot in the Smoky Mountains, you hear about Bigfoot, in the Himalayas, and in the, in Siberia, and all these different places. Or do they all kind of look the same, or are there like different species of Bigfoot?
Well, I think there's different species to a degree, because like the Yeti and some of those that you have in the Himalayas, their fur is white or whiter. And, again, that's just probably natural camouflage. They've adapted to that environment. But I think they're all still related to some degree. And to me, that was one of the facts that always stuck to me about those hominids, creatures, whatever they are, is that all cultures seem to have them. You have them in the Himalayas, you have them in Japan, you have them in Australia. Here in the United States, you've got different variants. You've got the Sasquatch, which is a little different from Bigfoot, which is different from what they call the skunk ape in Florida. So it's just same flavors, different flavors of the same thing, I think, but it's all still somehow connected. It's a hair-covered human-like creature that walks upright, or can walk upright. I saw some fascinating drawings the other day that a person had done from a reporting where a Bigfoot was doing like a spider crawl thing, where it had its arms and legs spread out and was crawling along like a spider. Excuse me, tickling my throat. Now that, to me, I mean, seeing Bigfoot would be bad enough, but if it had its legs all the way extended to where the torso was just a few inches off the ground and was able to ambulate like that would scare the daylights out of you.
Yeah, most certainly would. Excuse me, I gotta clear my throat too sometimes. So, I guess what I'm trying to ask is that there's possibility that there's tunnels underground. Have you ever heard any stories of people using, I mean, we've got ground penetrating radar now. Has anybody gone over the forests in say, Oregon or Washington and looked at the ground penetrating radar for any kinds of tunnels?
Not that I'm aware of. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't. I just may not be aware of it, but I think that'd be a good idea. And, they've used some of the heat-seeking radar and things like that in the missing person cases, and the FLIR and some of those, the forward-looking infrared. But I've heard stories, particularly like Mount Shasta that I spoke of earlier, of tunnels and things there, and supposedly whole civilizations. Depending on which stories you listen to, there's a band of people called the Lemurians that were somehow from, I think, Atlantis, that made it to California, and they live inside the mountain, according to the local legends there. And there's been sightings of people that wear a lot of gold and dress in white robes and things. Maybe some sort of New Age cultists, or is it really a race of people that have figured out a way to live in there? There's supposed to have been people there that have stumbled across what they described as a tropical paradise inside the mountain, like they were making their way through a cave or cavern. In that place, it's the volcano tubes. So there's all kinds, a whole maze of tunnels under Mount Shasta. It's, even though I think it's dormant, the USGS still considers it active, even though it hadn't erupted in hundreds of years. But supposedly somebody was going through those lava tubes and came out into a place where it was daylight. There was, tropical vegetation and fresh water and animals and things. But
Well,
if you
that
fly,
would be the inner Earth, I would imagine.
yeah, isn't that fascinating?
What do you think about those stories? I had somebody who was in the star seeds and the inner Earth on the show not too long ago, and they say that there's dinosaurs that live down there, and it's all it's a whole hollow Earth, and it has its own sun. The Earth's core is its own sun, and man, it's an interesting theory. It definitely
Yeah,
is.
it boggles the mind. I've read some of those Hollow Earth books, and it kind of ties in with the Shaver mystery. He wrote extensively about Mount Shasta and those people and the lands inside the Earth. So it makes you wonder.
Yeah, she did mention Mount Shasta too as being one of the entrances to the inner Earth. She did say that.
Hmm.
Oh man, it's such an interesting world. To think that we've got all these different aliens coming around. Bigfoot and black-eyed kids and ghosts and shadow people and goodness sakes, man, it just seems like
So a lot going on that either in an alternate dimension or one that coexists with ours. But that's the thing I enjoy about the paranormal. There's so many paths and so many rabbit holes you can chase down. And like I said, for me, it's been a lifelong adventure, and I'm still not close to any answers. If anything, I have more questions. And Sysco that we mentioned, she compares it to an onion. That the paranormal is like a giant onion. You peel back one layer, there's another layer right under that one, and it just goes on and on and on. And one time I asked her, well, what happens when you get to the middle of an onion? And I thought, well, probably more onion besides that. It's the paranormal. Who knows?
yeah. So not everything can be real, right? I mean, we have so many stories of the paranormal, but not everything could be real. I mean, wouldn't that just prove a lack of human imagination? What paranormal entity is out there that you think is just human imagination?
Well, that's an interesting thing too, especially if you believe in concepts like the tulpa, where you can take something that's not real and create it out of your mind. Um, like Slender Man, for example, that started out as just creepy stories on the internet, but then once it became a part of the consciousness of everybody, or to a great degree, a large number of people, then you start having sightings of it. You had the little girls, I can't remember where it was, that had planned to kill another classmate to sacrifice to
Yeah, I
Slender
remember
Man.
that. That was a frightening story for
Yeah, and
sure.
they're like, what, 10, 11, 12 years old? Where do you come up with something like that? When I was 12 years old, I played kickball and watched cartoons. I didn't think, I'm going to murder my classmate because Slender Man wants me to. So I think there are things that don't exist, or things that can be perceived as one thing where your imagination can take over that are actually something else. And I've got a story like that in Strange Things in the Woods called The Light in the Coffin. Another coffin story here. But this one, young man was seeing this girl that lived quite a ways away, courting, they called it down south. And Sunday evening, they'd been sitting on her porch. Got dark, came time for him to go home, and he thought, well, I can take the road, and it's going to be, a lot further than if I just cut through the woods, even though it's dark and spooky back there. Had to get up early the next morning, farm boy. Farm life starts before daylight if you have to milk cows and feed the chickens and all that stuff.
Hmm.
So he thinks, well, I'll just cut through the woods here and shave off some walk time. Well, somewhere along his walk in the woods, off to one side in the bushes there, he sees a coffin with a light in it. Well, it scares the daylights out of him. He takes off running. By the time he gets home, he's ran through briar patches. He's scratched. He's cut. He's bloody. He's ripped his good Sunday clothes. Gets there. He's all out of breath, scared to death. Bursts in, tells the family what he's seen. Well, his mother must have been like my grandmother. Instantly, well, it's an omen. It's a warning. It's important. Somebody's going to die. So scared this guy, and he starts getting worked up, afraid it's him since he's the one that saw the coffin with the light in it. And finally, the dad, who had a little more reasoning or wasn't quite so superstitious or however you want to look at it, says, okay, I've had enough. Come on, you're coming with me. We're going to go back and find this coffin in the woods. So reluctantly, he goes with his father. He takes him back out in the dark woods here. And sure enough, off in the bushes, he sees the light again. He's like, oh, there it is, there it is. Well, he stays there and won't go near it. The father wades through the bushes and the briars and gets over there. All of a sudden, he lets out just a hearty laugh. And he's like, son, I want you to come here right now and see this. So again, reluctantly, the guy goes over there. It was an old tree that had been struck by lightning that had fallen down and kind of rotted out to where it was hollow. Inside the hollowed out part of the tree there that was exposed, there was a spider web, and in the spider web, there was a lightning bug. So there's your coffin, there's your light. It was the guy's imagination and walking through the scary woods. But he said if his father hadn't dragged him back out there and shown him what it was, that he felt like he probably would have died of fright that night, just convinced himself that he was going to die because of what he had seen. So there are things like that where the mind kind of fills in the blanks, and it makes you wonder because, it's like looking at the clouds or whatever. You can see a bunny rabbit and a dragon and all kinds of things if you study the clouds, but it's just your mind connecting those dots. So I think there are some things that aren't paranormal so much as they are imagination, but then there's other things that are not imagination whatsoever, like the black-eyed kids experience. I know I didn't imagine that. I know just as sure as I'm sitting here talking to you exactly what happened. I didn't mistake the way their eyes looked. They got close enough. I could see that their eyes were like lumps of coal.
Yeah, I remember being a kid. I think I was about 8 or 9 years old. I was laying in my bed, and I always slept with the blinds up. And I was looking out the window, and the driveway went by my window. I was looking out my window, and I could have sworn I saw an alien with glowing eyes staring at me through the window. And I just started screaming and yelling and calling for my mom, and my parents come running down into the room, and they're like, what? And I'm like, there's something out there. It's staring in my window. It's an alien. And they're looking out there like, what are you talking about? What's the matter with you? And sure enough, it was a couple lights reflecting off a hubcap that was shining into the window. And once oh well, that's what he's looking at right there. That's what he's seeing. And I kind of they call me over, and I go over and look out, and sure enough, it's what it was. But
yeah,
it certainly scared the crap out of me when I saw
like that. I remember one time, I'd gone to sleep early. My girlfriend at the time had graciously done my laundry, brought it into the bedroom, and put it on the chair. Well, I woke up in the middle of the night and looked at the chair and just saw a form there, Oh, what's that? But it turned out I'm afraid of my own laundry, but didn't know that's what it was. So it is possible to be fooled, and if you don't take the time to look closely. But then there's other things that I don't think you want to look too closely, because if it is something real and it's supernatural or whatever, then it's probably something best left alone or ran away from.
Do you think that we're manifesting these things into becoming reality?
And I think it can happen. Again, if you subscribe to the theory of the tulpa, which that's not just a Cherokee thing. That's in a lot of different societies and things. There was a study at the University of North Carolina years ago where they had a parapsychology lab. They're one of the first universities in the country to have one, if not the first. And they decided to do a thing where they would create a ghost by sitting and talking about it. And they would meet, I think, weekly, if not more often, and they would describe this spirit and how it behaved and what it did and what it could do and what it couldn't do and things, to the point that it actually began to manifest. And there was a book written about it. I can't for the life of me remember the name of it right now, but it was a fascinating study. And I think we do have powers of our mind that we don't know about that could explain things like telekinesis and psychokinesis and things like that, where scientists claim that we only use 10% of the brain. Well, if you could use, 50% or 100% of your brain, what would you be capable of? Would you be able to send thoughts telepathically or move something across the room? Who knows? But I think that may play into it as well. There's even people that look at poltergeist cases, and a lot of times there will be a female child that's approaching puberty in houses that have a poltergeist. And one of the theories is that it's something that's going on because of this girl's changing metabolism and things that causes these outbursts that appear to be supernatural. Again, who knows? But it's something good to think about. Get a drink here. Wet my throat. Another fascinating story is Walter Gibson. He's the man who created all the shadow stories in the old pulp magazines and the radio plays. Wrote hundreds of them, if not thousands. I think he wrote under the name Maxwell Grant, but the man's name was Walter Gibson. Had an apartment in Greenwich Village in New York City. And there would come a point where people at his dinner parties would see a character that looked like the Shadow. The Shadow's name in the series was Lamont Cranston. He wore a big black overcoat and a scarf and a slouch hat. Well, people started seeing the Shadow in Walter Gibson's apartment. And they were like, oh, what'd you do, hire somebody to dress up like the Shadow? And he claimed that it was a psychic impression. Now, this was a man who was so prolific. He had, it's like 5 or 6 typewriters. And he would be working on a different story in each typewriter. And he would go from one to the other. No writer's block for him. He just jumped from story to story. And he claimed that it was a psychic impression created by all the literal blood, sweat, and tears he had poured into creating this character of the Shadow and all the adventures he'd sent him on. He said, my mind created him, and he's here. And Hans Holzer, later in the 60s, investigated that apartment. I'll send you the link, but there's a real interesting account of that online where Holzer went into the same apartment where they were having problems with the haunting, and it was the same apartment where Gibson claimed to have manifested the Shadow just from sitting and thinking and writing about it for hundreds and hundreds of hours.
Well, I mean, then that comes into question there, that if all of this disclosure that they're talking about on the news and UFOs in the news, and the more and more people believe it, the more and more becomes the possibility that we're actually going to manifest it into reality.
Yeah. So, it's one of those, it's, as Charles Fort said, one measures a circle beginning anywhere. Is it something we've created? Was it there? And by thinking about it, we've created more of them? Or, it's fascinating. It's one of those things that if you spend too much time thinking about it, I think you'll drive yourself crazy. But, but it's one of those things that's fun to think about. It's fun to conjecture about. And a lot of this stuff, I don't think we'll ever have any hard scientific answers.
Well, hopefully the aliens land during the Super Bowl. That would just be fascinating.
I'm interested to see, because to keep hearing all this hints and rumors in the UFO community that something big is about to, there have to be some big disclosure coming. So I don't know. I've been waiting for it since the 60s, 70s.
Yeah, I mean they've been talking about it a long time, and I think that once we see one thing, we're going to see it all.
Yeah, I think that if UFOs come into existence, then that's going to be, just more fuel for Bigfoot, for Dogmen, for parallel dimensions, for psychic abilities, for beings from other planets, other star systems, and what. I think, like you said, it'll bring everything to a point, and that'll be just a big paradigm shift in everything, knowledge. But some of the theories and arguments make sense, that if you look at how far technology progressed in the last century, a lot of people claim that a lot of that was during the last half of the 20th century.
Yeah, and that's just the technology that we know about. Right.
The technology that's available on a consumer level. I've heard of some of the things that the technical stuff that the colleges and things are able to look at the super collider, the hadron or the hydro. I can't remember the name of the hadron collider.
Yeah, CERN.
CERN, yeah. What's going on there? There's people that claim that's somehow connected to the Mandela effect, that whatever they're doing is causing things in the past to change very minutely.
Yeah, I mean they're talking about they're creating black holes, little miniature black holes. I mean, what would that do?
Well, supposedly that's antimatter, and if it got out of control, that could be a doomsday scenario.
Oh my goodness! Or maybe it could have been that they've already done something that doomsdayed us. We just don't
Well,
even know it yet.
that's another claim that the Aztec calendar was right, that civilization as we know it actually ended in 2012, and all this that's gone on since and that we're in now is an alternate time stream.
Yeah, or this is all just a simulation now.
Yeah, keep hearing that we are in the Matrix. We live in the Matrix.
Yeah, it's just incredible to think about. Steve, you're a fascinating person, and we
Thank you.
definitely look forward to having you on again. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure, absolutely. Again, you can find my books on Amazon and wherever fine books are sold. My publisher told me to say that. Strange Things in the Woods and My Strange World. The first one, stories I've collected. The second one, my own stories. I'm on YouTube at 13 Past Midnight, which is my personal channel. And then I'm the co-owner over at Missing Persons and Mysteries. Our main focus there is missing persons cases, but on the mysteries part of the name, we delve into some deep, dark rabbit holes, shadow people. Right now, the subscriber, the listener stories are big. We're up to like 7 volumes of listener stories, and some of the stories that people send in are just amazing. So a lot going on over there. I'm on Facebook, Steve Stockton 8181. You can also reach me at that email address, stevestockton81@gmail.com. And I'm on Twitter at Strange and Odd, all one word. And I love hearing from people, love hearing about personal encounters, and just that's part of the joy of this, is connecting with other people that have had experiences. And when you do stuff like I do and go on shows like this, it helps other people open up. I've had so many people come to me and say, well, I was afraid to talk about this, for fear of ridicule or people thinking I was crazy or being judged by it. But, I don't do any of that. I love to hear the stories, just things that I've seen personally. I can't judge anybody and what they say. I take their stories for the truth. I'm not a researcher. I don't go out and vet anything. I'm a storyteller. I like passing on the legend. I love legend tripping, going to those places, not looking for anything other than just to bask in the ambiance of whatever's happened there.
Yeah, there's everybody has their own story, and you should get it out there. And if you need to keep your story a secret, I'm sure Steve will keep it a secret. As far as if you want your story to be told and you want to remain anonymous, I'm sure that Steve will respect that, won't you, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably more than half of the stories that I do on the channel there are anonymous. Sometimes, though, once they see the reaction in the comments and they get a little comfortable with that, they'll actually join into the comment section and say, hey, I was the one that sent in this story. Thanks for your feedback, and what do you think about this, that, and the other? So it's a way of connecting people that have had, if not similar experiences, just have similar feelings about those experiences, and kind of fostering a community there that's of like-minded people that are open-minded toward the paranormal and the supernatural. I think that's important.
Awesome. And thanks very much, Steve, for coming on. We'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. That's going to do it for us today. Remember, you can always find us online, www.conflictradio.net. Everything is uploaded there. That is uploaded on our YouTube channel, the Conflict Radio Network. You can also find us on Spreaker, Apple iTunes, and your normal podcast catchers. That's going to do it for us today. We'll be back on Thursday night with another show. Batten down the hatches and be safe.